Thank you for being on and joining us. I know a second meeting within the month is a lot, but there's a lot to talk about. So we're really appreciate that you all made time to be here. No shortage of other meetings going on. A couple of things to mention before we get started. The topic of the meeting today, as you know from the materials, is talking about housing recommendations. So we will start the meeting with HRNA going over some overview of the process and some sort of guiding principles around these recommendations. And then we'll talk about the breakout groups, which is the next piece that we'll go into. And we will be dividing you all into groups, sort of started randomly, and then we divided people to make sure we didn't have two of any organization on the same group. And so what we'll be doing in those discussions is having two halves of discussion. The first half, you'll talk about an assigned topic, one of the three topics that are in there, and then the second half of your small group discussion will be opened up because we want to give you a chance to weigh in on the other topics as well. After that, we'll come together and have a group discussion with some report out from those different groups. We want to let you know, just like our other meetings, this is going to be recorded. It is being recorded right now. We'll record both the beginning and the end piece where we're all here, as well as each breakout group discussion. If we were having these meetings in person, people would be available or welcome to come and join. So we want to make sure they can hear the discussion. We know this is the first time we're going through these recommendations, and it's not the last. So there's a lot of information that we sent out, and we have other information, detailed information we'll be sharing tonight. So, we want to just take our time and walk through these with you and get your input. And that's why we're using those small groups, so we can have a little more face-to-face time with you and, respond to questions. The last thing I want you to know is just a couple updates from the last meeting. We did talk about a few things. The final engagement summary, we went through the draft version of that at our last meeting. I wanted to let you know that the goal is to get that sort of a refined version of that posted in the next couple of days. We're also posting the data with that. So that'll be up, and we'll send out an email blast to everyone to let them know, or at least everyone who's on the email list. The other thing is we
rained on.
Oh, sorry, was that a question? Or maybe just an errant microphone thing. The other thing we mentioned, I think maybe Ashley mentioned this last time, was there was an urge to see the sort of final version of the draft land use map that was developed during the 2017-2018 process. So we have posted that on the website now, along with the other chapters that were developed. So you can find that on the materials page there. That all being said, I'm going to stop talking and pass this off to HRNA to get us started.
Thank you, Jenny. So, Phil Cash, glad to see everybody. I want to really reemphasize everything that was just said. The day, this session is probably the most material we're ever going to go through. We're going to break you into small groups to have those conversations. Want to really emphasize that this is not anywhere near the last chance you're going to get to talk about these tools or make comments on these tools. We're going to take feedback today. We're going to have conversations. We're going to take feedback today. We're going to draft something up. You're going to get to see that. You're going to get to make comments on that. Then there'll be additional rounds for iteration. So this is the start of a conversation, not anywhere, not nearly a full conversation. This is always one of the harder conversations we have, just because we have to cover so many materials, and there's both a desire to get deep into the weeds and a need to have a longer distant view on it. It's more difficult, frankly, to do it remotely, just because it is. But we think we have a good setting. We're going to go through it. So as we do this, the real emphasis today is for you all to understand what the tools are we're looking at, and for us to hear back from you which tools. That's good. You can go to the next slide. Which tools you see as the highest priority, because it's not possible to move every single thing forward. It doesn't mean you don't think all the things are important, but there has to be some prioritization, and we want you to start in that, be part of that conversation. And we want to hear from you. Are there tools in here that you don't think are such a great idea that we could maybe take off the list? So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about what the tools are the highest priority, which tools don't belong in here, and then for the tools that are the highest priority, what are the actions or steps it's going to take to actually move them forward. So we're going to give you a little bit of update on what we're doing. We're going to talk a little bit about our framework because there's some values and larger framework that came from the conversations that you guys are giving us. Then we're going to get into our breakout groups and we're going to report back. I'll hand it over to Sarah and we'll start to go through where we're at.
Great, thanks so much. So this is just kind of a reminder of where we are in our process. Good way to just kind of refresh everybody. We've talked about housing tools. We're going to still be talking about tools today, but they're starting to look more like recommendations and goals. So our goal is to cover less what is this tool and what can it do for Charlottesville, and more how should we be thinking about how we can make recommendations for the housing plan to support the goals for affordable housing that the city is setting. And for our next conversation, as Philip said, you'll have more opportunities to provide feedback on those recommendations. We'll be providing a draft plan with those recommendations and everything else for comment. We've been doing a lot of work since the last time we talked. We received really great feedback from you, the steering committee, about all of those different tools that we provided an overview of. We've been having a lot of conversations with stakeholders, including some of the people on this call, just to sort of talk through some of our initial ideas about a framework for the plan and some of the recommendations and the shape that those are starting to take. And we've been continuing to do work on those feasibility and potential impacts analysis that we talked about during our last meeting. So that's really where we are. Just to visit briefly the very detailed survey, and thank you all very much for taking the time to fill it out, that we circulated following the last meeting. The feedback that we received from that survey has really helped us to shape not just the list of tools that are included in the recommendations, but how we're framing the conversations that we're having, and how we're framing the specifics of the recommendations. So you can see there was pretty strong support across the board for many of the tools that we have on our list. Several that had lower support. You'll see that some of those are still in here, but we're definitely looking for feedback from you on whether the approaches that we've taken with those tools are the right ones, or whether we need to make changes or perhaps eliminate those if they're not right for Charlottesville. Any questions at this point?
I don't have a question, but this is Emily Dreyfus. I wanted to make a comment that the steering committee is so not representative of the community, let alone the people most affected by the affordable housing crisis. So I hope we just take this input with a big grain of salt and do other things to get more input from people who are more directly affected.
That point is well taken. I think we recognize it and want to address it in a couple of ways. One is that the draft set of recommendations will be circulated to the community at large, and there will be intentional outreach to make sure there's engagement there. Two, there's a whole section we're going to talk about today about the governance of both whatever housing plan is enacted and any funding that goes forward, and how that governance structure is going to make sure that the voices of those that are facing housing challenges are directly involved in making decisions how funding. So we're going to have both in the planning process, we're going to have some additional checkpoints to make sure that we get that. And then we want to talk about how do we improve the process for how housing is managed in Charlottesville going forward. So acknowledge the point, and we recognize and are trying to work on it.
And I will say, while this steering committee survey was a very helpful point for us to start to think about some of the specific comments that were provided, it is definitely not the only thing that was used in shaping the recommendations that you're going to see today.
Yeah. And just to reemphasize that, we were interested in how people voted it, but we were much more interested, frankly, in your comments. And you guys gave us a lot of comments that were quite, sometimes in conflict with each other, but quite helpful and quite interesting. So thank you.
Okay, I think we've already covered this, but as we've said, our goal for today is to provide you an overview of how we're thinking about the plan and the recommendations, and then really give time for an in-depth discussion about the recommended goals and tools, and thinking about particularly what the priorities are and the implementation needs for those priority tools. So I'm going to provide a brief update on the plan framework, and then we're just going to jump right into our breakout groups. So the first thing that I think some of you have seen this already, we're thinking about 3 potential guiding principles that have really come out of the work that we've done so far. These are not any, they don't live in any particular recommendation, but they're really lenses through which we're thinking about what a successful affordable housing plan needs to do for Charlottesville. So racial equity, we know, I mean, that was really part of the conversation from the beginning, but making sure that we're making recommendations that support racial equity in housing in Charlottesville and that break down some of the barriers that have existed historically in the city. Regional collaboration, so identifying ways in which we can make recommendations not just for the city, but identify opportunities for the city to partner within the region with the county, with the surrounding jurisdictions, with the university, leveraging all of the different groups that are involved in housing in Charlottesville and the surrounding area. And finally, we think that the plan can't be a success if we don't take a comprehensive approach. And by that we mean thinking about a range of types of housing solutions, thinking about how we can combine subsidy, land use, tenants' rights, and also think about rental, home ownership, and serving the housing needs of a lot of different types of populations. So I wanted to provide an overview of this really as you start to think about the tools when you get into your breakout groups. We want to think about, you know, does this tool support racial equity? Is there an opportunity for the city to collaborate with regional partners in advancing this recommendation? And is this a truly important part of a comprehensive approach to affordable housing in Charlottesville? The plan structure, we've got recommendations in 5 different categories. The first 3 are the tool types that we talked about last time, so land use, tenants' rights, and subsidy. And the second 2 we're calling implementation needs. They're basically recommendations not of what the city should do, but how it should do it. And those are around funding. So whereas subsidy is how you're spending the money, funding is how you're committing the money and how much money is available to support affordable housing programs. And governance, which is how decisions get made, how the actions get carried out. And that's really, to Emily's point, one place where we're bringing in, we want to really talk about how to make sure that community voices are reflected in the decision-making around the city's investments and priorities. Any questions there about either the guiding principles or the categories of recommendations that we're going to be talking about? Great. So
Sarah, so you have a hand raised.
Oh, do I? I'm sorry.
Okay.
Thanks, Latoya and Sarah. I just wanted to ask quickly the issue of property tax protections. Where does that fall in the 3 types of tools? Is that accounted for in one of those 3 buckets?
Yeah, tax relief, we're considering a form of subsidy.
Okay. All right, thank you.
No problem. So for the breakout groups, everybody's been assigned to a breakout group that is going to focus at first on one of these 3 sets of categories. So one group on land use, tenants' rights and governance together, and subsidy and funding, because again, they're kind of 2 halves of the same question. When you're going to review a little bit about how these types of tools or how these types of this recommendation works, what it can do, what it can't do, and then the recommendations that we're currently working with for within those categories. And the key things that we'd really like you to discuss are, you know, do you agree? First of all, do you agree with the recommendations? Are there any changes, any concerns that you have as you read through them? Secondly, what are the highest priority tools within each topic? What should Charlottesville be really focused on advancing in the next couple of years? And are there any tools that you would just get rid of or make substantial changes to? And finally, what are the key actions and who are the key partners that will ensure the successful implementation of those recommendations? There's a lot more there. What we'd like you to do is review each of the recommendations at a high level, and then if there are questions, things that are unclear, or things where you really have identified a priority and want to get into more detail and provide more detailed feedback, there's a lot more detail in there, and so the facilitators will be there to help you kind of guide those discussions and dive into more detail as there is time. In terms of how we're dividing up time for the breakout groups, as I said, each group has an assigned topic or topics. We're asking that you spend the first half of the breakout group time on those assigned topics. If you have wrapped up, you feel like you've pretty much covered what you wanted to cover on your assigned topics, then the group can pick another topic or maybe two topics that you want to change to. So for instance, and spend the rest of the time on that. So for instance, if I am spending my first half of my time on tenants' rights and governance, but we feel like we've gotten to a pretty good point, we've discussed all of the things we wanted to discuss on tenants' rights and governance, we can then maybe elect to spend the second half of our time on land use. And each group should select somebody to report out, and we're going to ask you to come back at the end and each group to spend about 5 minutes telling us what were the key priorities, any major concerns that you have, and any changes that you would make.
So as we break down the groups, this is a chance for us to make sure everybody really understands the tools in detail. So ask questions if something's not clear. If we've used an acronym that doesn't make any sense, like we try to be careful about that, but call us out on it. Housing people are terrible about that. So because we can't have discussion about what's effective or not effective if there's not understanding. And then we really want there to be discussion within the group about what the priorities are and how to make it happen. And it's okay if there's disagreement and different views. You don't have to reach a unanimous opinion within your group, but we want to talk about the different, what different folks are seeing as priorities and why, because that will help us frame up the next spaces going forward. So really looking forward to this being in a conversation.
And I just want to say before we get going, we broke out these groups, as I said, with the whole steering committee. So please bear with us. Not everyone was able to make it today, or some people maybe aren't here yet that are planning to come. So we might have to do some adjustments in the groups, but we'll hope to get going as soon as we can with those discussions.
Yeah, my group was focused on land use. Ashley, do you want to share a little briefly what we talked about, especially around sort of the key discussion points, and then we'll go to the other. I think there was another group talking about land use as well.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Ashley Davies. We got to dig a little further into the 4 recommendations of land use, and those are making multifamily by right and easier to achieve in the city. The second was looking at soft density, or we have been calling the missing middle. So looking at the transformation of some of our single family areas and allowing smaller infill opportunities throughout the city. We also discussed ADUs, or accessory dwelling units, and inclusionary zoning. And so for the first topic, the multifamily piece, we were thinking about the areas where there might be more multifamily allowed, but also how you really, we think this is a huge opportunity for the city, getting to more of a by right place with multifamily, and thinking about also how you can pair that with the new inclusionary zoning that is allowed in Charlottesville. And I think I've been living under my COVID rock because I didn't even know that had come through this year. But some of the trickier conversations that we were having is, as you look at these tools to, I guess, increase the efficiency of getting affordable units into the city, it's less about the how to do it and more, the trickier part is the where to do these things and how to, yeah, if you're doing it in one area, what are the pros and cons of that? And how do you introduce these tools in a way that they can be effective and not negatively impacting the community? And it's very tricky. So I think both the multifamily and the soft density conversation was probably the hardest for us, because that's looking at more of the areas that have been historically redlined, and how can we transform some of the single family areas of the city. I think we were predicting that that's going to feel pretty threatening to a lot of neighborhoods. And so figuring out how you bring that tool into play in a way that you can see but not feel, not have the community feel overly threatened. And that's when we got more into the ADU conversation, because that tool is already available in the city and has been available for quite some time. So Chip from our group had the great idea that that could be a nice, it won't solve our problems, but it's a nice tool to begin with, in that it's already available and could probably just have some minor tweaks to see more accessory dwelling units going into the city. And that is one way to get more units into the single areas that might be less threatening. But we think all the recommendations that you consultants have come up with are very beneficial, but I think we'll have to spend more time thinking about the strategy of how you introduce them into the city in a way that they don't immediately just get squashed. So how can we do that in a hopefully a non-threatening way, and really get towards this goal of getting more units and affordable units on the ground in Charlottesville? And I'm going to hand it over to Chip now, because he wanted to really focus a little bit more on adding more language on regionalism in that conversation, and how do we work as a region to have more tools available.
Just real quickly, and not just in the land use area, where we did discuss looking at joint opportunities of small area plans where there are neighborhoods that cross jurisdictional boundaries with Albemarle County, of trying to focus on small area plans. They are very, very similar to the hydraulic and 29 small area plan that Albemarle and Charlottesville jointly approved. And making that one of the strategies of prioritizing those areas, not only to encourage joint planning activities and land use changes, but also to prevent conflicting land uses when one jurisdiction chooses a different type of land use. So in a more general type statement for land use in other areas, of course, with my regional hat on, trying to emphasize that one of the guiding principles is to have more regional discussion and regional view. And it's really not mentioned that often throughout these documents. And so I think any place that we can look for regional opportunities and put that in writing would be a real benefit.
That's really helpful. And I think on the land use piece, there's a number of spots we want to call it out. So that's helpful. Okay. We talked about land use. Would the tenants' rights and a tenants' rights and governance group be interested in speaking by any chance?
We can. Do we want to go through the other land use groups as well at the same time, or do we want?
Yeah, no. Sorry, you're right. You're right. Absolutely. I was just skipping over all my other language. Susan, you're not technically a land use group. You don't get to go yet.
So is that whoever was with Dina, maybe?
Well, Dina and Lee, and we had about 6 or so people in our group as well. We got a lot of positive responses toward many of the recommendations. And there was concern repeated several times about making sure that these land use recommendations protect Black neighborhoods, that too often there has been change that has demolished or deteriorated Black neighborhoods, and that was an essential for the group to pay attention to. We received a lot of positive feedback on all of the recommendations. We didn't go through each one in detail, and I hope that people will be encouraged to look at this again and give us some additional feedback. But there was concern about whether we're just looking at existing transit corridors as opportunities for multifamily, or looking at the opportunities to expand transit corridors, along with where parcels are available, and to develop them. There was some question about city policies related to public housing locations that are not built on right now, and whether those areas could in fact be developed in the future. And so there was some discussion about that as well, and people were unclear about what the city's policies were about that as well. We talked a lot about existing parking requirements as limiting factors for increasing density in an area, and talked about the opportunities that might accrue from changing to something like a market-driven parking policy rather than the current policies that are currently in place. Soft density, we got a really positive reaction to on the whole, particularly since if the soft density were to be owner occupied, it was felt that was a really positive feature, but that we have to think about affordability as well, and sort of what someone described as deep affordability for these units, and not just have it be redevelopment that doesn't solve that affordability problem as well. There was a remark that we need to broaden the SUP process in ways that don't displace people. The recommendations regarding inclusionary zoning, we only got to at the very end. There was some positive reaction to them. That's just what happens when they come last. But I think we need more feedback on the whole issue of inclusionary zoning as well. Lee, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just one more thing that I thought was powerful, and that was Emily's suggestion that the steering committee, and for that matter, the city, should start boldly, because no matter what, this is going to be run through the mill, and we'll have less on the table at the end than we begin with. And so to begin with as strong a strategy as we can stomach, in hopes of bringing forward then a meaningful answer through the whole process.
Got it. That's helpful feedback. So as you've been, my group ended up talking about land use a fair amount, but we'll wait and come back to it. Do we have who is the lead on tenants' rights and governance?
I'm gonna pass it off to Lisa, I think, to give our overview there, but others should feel free to jump in as well.
Absolutely, because I'm just going to give a brief overview, but please feel free, other members who were there, to chime in as well. Ours was tenants' rights and governance, and we came to a consensus that right to counsel should be prioritized, and this with the city helping to provide funding for tenants to make sure that if an issue arises, they have right to counsel. They're more likely to remain in their homes if they have a right to counsel. And another priority was first right of refusal, or a right of a tenant to purchase a property. For example, if they are currently living in a home, they've signed a lease, and the landlord decides that, hey, it's time for me to sell my property, and we would like for it to be written into the lease that that tenant has the first right of refusal, simply meaning that the landlord comes to them first. And in order to make them be more able to purchase the home, we would like for the city to have funding behind that, such as being able to provide a down payments assistance. But this could also work in regards to the housing voucher. If they're currently in the home under a voucher, there is a HUD program where a voucher can be transferred over into purchasing a home, and there are safeguards within that voucher program into home ownership where there is funding that could be set aside to ensure that new homeowner is successful throughout that first year. So we thought that that was important, and that is a way to help build wealth in the community and a way to help establish equality, another form of establishing equality. That is something that we want to run through this entire progress, this entire process, being mindful of social justice, equity, and inclusion. So those are two topics that we thought we wanted to prioritize over the ones that we saw. And on the back end, in terms of governance, we talked about efficiency and equitability and decision making and rebuilding clear communications within the communities. And we talked a lot about HAC, the Housing Advisory Committee, and we talked a little bit about the CAF, but more focused on the Housing Advisory Committee and whether or not it should be rebuilt, restructured in order to rebuild trust and diversity. There is some concern around its effectiveness as to how it's currently run and how the committee members are selected. And we went over who should be on the committee, and we really felt that we needed to drill down more on that process. And when we talk about having committee members be affordable housing experts or advocates, what does that really mean? And when you drill down on that, do you have members from the community or representative of the community in which you are going to be tasked with making recommendations to city council? Are they truly being represented, or is it part of what is now the status quo, more white men on the committee? If we use if we're not clear in our definition and making sure that, and there's nothing wrong with white men, but I'm just saying that a lot of times that's who ends up on these committees, and not very representative of the communities in which they are to be serving or helping to make policy recommendations for. So we really want to drill down on the committee members and whether or not revamping it and how to revamp it, whether or not it should be appointed by city council, or whether or not it should continue to be a recommendation process. And full disclosure, I currently sit on the HAC, and I do think that in some ways it should be rebuilt, definitely tweaked in some ways, because I don't feel that it fully represents the community in which a lot of times we are making decisions for. So any of my other members would like to chime in, please feel free. We had Missy, we had Liz, and we had Leah. And of course, Jennifer was our moderator during the group.
We're small but mighty.
Yes. Feel free to chime in.
I want to make sure we have time to get to subsidy and funding. Was there another tenants' rights and governance group or any other key points from that topic that were discussed in other groups that people want to bring up?
Yeah, there was just the one group, but if
Great.
others had
Yeah.
We covered it well.
Yeah. Why don't we move on then to subsidy and funding so that we can hear from those groups.
Chantel, do you want to take a first pass and talk about what we covered?
Sure. You know, Phil, I knew you were going to call on me. Susan, you are going to have to help, and Phil, if you can. I would really appreciate that. But so Susan and I were in this subsidy and funding group. I will say we did initially start out as dipping into the land use, and similar to what's already been shared around, you know, we were really in favor of the inclusionary zoning, and some folks have already talked about the multifamily by right and like where strategically where'd that be located and how we could take a racial equity approach to utilizing that tool or that strategy. So those are two of the things we kind of end up falling into, even though we were tasked with looking at the subsidy and funding. On the topic that we were supposed to get through, we weren't able to look at all of the recommendations because we spent half the time in land use, but we were able to look through some of the recommendations around reducing development costs for affordable rental housing units, and Phil kind of pushed us to try to prioritize which recommendations we thought were the best when all of them really are strong and great. We did talk a bit about public housing redevelopment in the preservation fund. So really, you know, supporting the redevelopment and modernizing of public housing that hasn't been done for a really, really long time that CRHA or the Charlottesville Redevelopment Housing Authority is sitting over. And then we also went into depth on really understanding what a preservation fund would do, what's it about, how at one point I thought it was related to the CAF fund. It's not. I heard Lisa, you were talking about CAF, and we also talked about that a bit and how the city may need to redesign how that funding works, or just put more, just strengthen it a bit. And then we also went into discussion on increasing and preserving access to affordable home ownership. And again, we thought a lot of these recommendations were pretty spot on. We tended to talk a little bit more about the down payment assistance and home buyer counseling. So basically providing some funding to reduce the upfront cost of purchasing a home. So to build a pipeline of potential home buyers. And then we also talked about property tax relief. That's really targeted, like income specific or income eligible, income qualified homeowners, and being able to give folks help with reducing some of the property tax cost, which Phil was saying could be a way to, oh gosh, was this one of our tools against gentrification? I'm not sure.
The ways to ease just gentrification displacement, yeah. Mm-hmm. Or displacement, maybe not gentrification, but displacement.
Okay. Awesome. Susan, do you have anything else?
You did a wonderful job. Thank you, Chantel. I think the one thing that we may have focused on for a minute is to really bake in some of these zoning, inclusionary zoning, and some of the other things that there seems to be a lack of consistency. Is that fair to say, Philip, that that's what we had?
A lot of discretion. There's a lot of discretion.
Right. And we actually felt, all of us kind of felt a clearer path as to what everyone felt was appropriate would be more useful. Is that?
Yeah, I believe some of the words that we used was that it needs to be just like clear and direct, and just mm-hmm. If that's the policy, then set it and have it be clear. Yeah.
And that the other thing that we did point out, and especially Philip walked us through that, is that we are a very small city of 50,000 people, but we have ideas that are much bigger than that, and kind of pointed out that the amount of money we have to use is not sufficient Is that fair to say? Sufficient to do all that we really want to do. So that ends up being disappointing.
There's a tough prioritization conversation, which we had, and we had to some extent, but I don't think we deprioritized anything.
We wouldn't. Chantal and I would not prioritize.
Yeah, Phil made us look at a budget sheet.
We said no.
All the money and where it could be used, and it was clear that we didn't have enough money to support everything, but we couldn't decide what was the best tool. But you know, that's what you guys are for, right? Like,
we did say that to you, Philip. We said that.
It was a very helpful conversation. It was. It gave clarity. It gave clarity on priorities. It gave clarity on priorities, and we talked about the challenges. It's budgeting is tough.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm interested to hear what the other group, the other subsidy and funding group, if they may fix it for us.
Mm-hmm. That'd be awesome.
Brandon, do you want to take it away? Give them all the answers that we came up with.
Yeah, I'm sure we probably fixed it. So we did, similar sort of acknowledge some land use issues, but we didn't dwell on it. But there, land use does play into all this a bunch. In terms of priorities, that was very difficult. But I think we sort of identified a few things. So, affordability being a major factor in where you place your money, and anti-displacement efforts. And so you could look at some of the suggested strategies and put them in sort of groups where you have like public housing redevelopment and LIHTC gap funding, kind of giving you a lot of units and the ability to target for much lower incomes. And then, for both like preservation, but also mortgages, down payment assistance, looking at where you target those programs would be important. But those all kind of fit into sort of anti-displacement, preserving affordability pile, and that being really important. And much of our conversation, then was about leveraging city money and how that can be done, and the idea that all these ideas are important and are necessary. But the city really should be, using its money wisely instead of sort of the process they have now. It's kind of like a grant process, with the acknowledgement that, public housing is going to be supported, but there are other builders and such out there that that really are taking advantage of the city, that the city could negotiate a whole lot better use of its money. So we talked about affordability periods being extended beyond 15 years. Alex particularly thought that was ridiculous that a community would allow that, that we could do a whole lot better for the money. And if others don't like it, then they should go to and, just attaching sort of the city's affordable housing goals to the sources of money would be extremely important in a way of dealing with leverage. So then, we also acknowledged, the importance of having sustained funding, that, the money could dry up. And of course, we probably need more, but it does need to be consistent and sustained to make these things work. So we talked a little bit about sources, and kind of landed on the TIF, tax increment financing, as a conversation that was sort of started in the city but sort of left hanging, and acknowledged there's a lot of contradictions in the community. Probably really needs to have a bigger conversation about that, and particularly about land use, where we're running out of land, and the Water Street idea was kind of used as an example, whereas if you had a TIF there, Yes, you could build and develop there and get funding that you could then use for affordable housing, but the community might not like the type of development that's occurring and be opposed to it. So there are a lot of contradictions within the TIF that the community really needs to sift through and come to some understanding and work on. Yeah, and we talked some about the CAF as well, as that process being flawed, that the city really doesn't ask for enough from the people who are coming to it for money. I hope that's about where we were at, something like that.
I guess what I hear is that you all, in terms of not asking enough from developers, I think that's actually exactly what the subsidy group I was with, Chantel and Susan got into, really, and how we got into the conversation about inclusionary zoning. So this seems to be a pretty common theme about, even in the subsidy group, we're talking about a land use tool, and both subsidy groups ended up talking about that land use tool. So that's helpful to understand in terms of prioritization. That's helpful to understand prioritization. It seems like something we can be clearer on, like, going forward. We are at time. I know, like, this was a lot to wrestle with. We went through a lot of different materials here. I hope that you all found it helpful. We're going to be sharing copies of these materials. I want to emphasize that these are rough working drafts. None of these ideas are what's actually are anywhere close to decided. We wanted to put recommendations and thoughts in front of you so that we could start to get feedback and have that conversation. It's a lot of material, so we want you to have it so you can wrestle with it some more and think about it and share additional thoughts. What we're going to be doing is taking what we heard from you all the notes from the different groups, starting to have some additional community conversations, and drafting out a more complete set of recommendations, a draft version of plan, and not just the recommendations, but why we came to these recommendations, so that we can go back to you again and have a conversation, and we can be going out to the community as a whole and different groups to hear their feedback and start to get communities. So this is the beginning of the process, but we want, we don't want to keep it hypothetical. There's so many different things. We want to put concrete recommendations in front of you so that we have something to refine and work on. So this, not talking about regionality enough, were very helpful. Like, that's something we can concrete address. The comments about, we need to be addressing inclusionary zoning, we need to be very clear about those, are very helpful. Like, your feedback has, I know it's a lot of material, but it is very helpful for us because it lets us know where your priorities and how you're thinking about this are, and frankly, just where we've made it too complicated or not clear enough, preservation funds, and how to be more direct. So, I don't know if there's any other comments or thoughts. Happy to hear them now, or be sent, receive email and phone calls.
I just wanna thank you guys. I thought the breakout session, how it was organized virtually, thought it was cool. This is the first time I've been in a virtual a discussion with a breakout session, and then after the breakout is done, then everybody comes together. So kudos, that was really good.
Thank you to Latoya for organizing that in the back end.
Yeah, that was neat.
And maybe someday we'll get to do a version of this in person. Because we're going to make you all do worksheets and dots and actually do a little budgeting. I hand worksheets on your own, so you have to budget and prioritize. So yeah, look forward to that. Thank you.